make a quick note about this booklet. So if you haven't seen this before, this is the 2012 NHMRC guidelines for the support of people with borderline personality disorder. We have copies that are for free outside, so please pick one up, because this still is the core of the approach that we take at Spectrum in helping people that are living with BPD. Okay, so I'm very excited to introduce our next speaker. This is Dr. Nitin Dharwadkar. Dr. Dharwadkar is a forensic psychiatrist in civil law and the principal at MedLegalMD, as well as an adjunct senior lecturer at Monash University. He's also an accredited psychiatrist at the Melbourne Clinic, founding and directing the Transcranial Magnetic Stimulation Center in 2013. He has a keen interest in building educational programs for the legal personnel to improve their understanding of complex trauma and personality disorders, facilitating access to medical legal experts and advocacy for people suffering from these conditions. So I'd like to welcome Nitin.
Thank you, Lucas, for that introduction. So we're going to talk about medical legal aspects pertaining to people who are suffering from complex trauma and personality disorder. So people who are already under treatment or may have been in remission but are faced with legal difficulties, primarily in the civil area, which is workers' compensation and personality disorder, and also family law. But we will kick off by talking a little bit about criminal law and also about the possibility when these people are faced with issues in the criminal justice system. So just a disclaimer that all this is an academic presentation and all the cases being described here are extensively embellished to protect confidentiality, or they're already in the public domain. So the limitations in the legal system stems from the very outset, like at the very core, which is not only the diagnosis itself, but the variations in the diagnosis, the variations in the different diagnostic systems, DSM and ICD, as well as the causes, the behaviors due to these diagnoses, the treatments available, the prognosis, and whether in some cases, as some legal professionals believe that some of the people suffering from these conditions never really get better. And so there is some kind of therapeutic pessimism surrounding these conditions, which are the limitations. So given that complex PTSD has been added to ICD-11 relatively recently, this just adds to the confusion, because in our system in Victoria, in both the civil law as well, in the civil law, which is compensation law or work cover, as well as family law, the DSM-5 seems to be the holy grail or the holy Bible by which questions are asked, by which hearings are conducted in all the judiciary courts. So going back, or going to the root of the word personality. So personality, as you're well aware, in the community, the lay meaning is intrinsic character or constitution of a person. And hence it is very difficult to kind of maintain a distance between the person themselves, the personhood, and a personality disorder. And therefore, this stems the immense challenges faced by the legal systems, especially when dealing with cases where the diagnosis is a personality disorder. So we'll look, like I was saying earlier, start with criminal law. We'll look at a mock jury case. And this was a case where there were two defendants. One was a defendant who had a severe personality disorder with a borderline pattern, and the other one was classified as a complex mental health problem. So before we leap into that case, let's look at diminished responsibility. Diminished responsibility is really a term which is a legal doctrine which absolves a person from culpability or from the full gravity of the charges placed against him or her, if it can be proven in the court of law that he or she has got an abnormality of the mind stemming from a mental disorder and which is substantially enough that it can cause problems with judgment, problems with intent, problems with understanding the responsibility of the action. And this can then not only decrease the liability for the person, but in many cases of murder, where the charges are murder, it can change over to manslaughter. So this is an important kind of legal doctrine used in this criminal courts. And we'll talk about it in a minute about what happens when someone is charged with a homicide or with a murder charge and when they have a diagnosis of a personality disorder. So in this mock jury trial, the participants were divided in two groups. One group was to do with severe personality disorder with a borderline pattern, and the other one was a complex mental health problem. So the manipulation of the diagnostic terminology was the only difference between the two groups. There was no other difference in the way the murder was committed or the homicide was committed. There was no difference in the processes of the court hearing. There was no differences in the witness statements. So the complex mental health problem group or that defendant was purposefully done so that there is no diagnostic label to that particular defendant. This was to just take away the bias of a diagnosis. So this was the control group compared to the other defendant who had the severe personality disorder with a borderline pattern. So what was the analysis? The analysis of the judgment appeared to be that the wording of the diagnosis, severe personality disorder with a borderline pattern, appeared to have adversely impacted the attitudes of the jury, consisting of whether diminished responsibility is there or not, and more in favor of the person who has got the complex mental health problem. The jury also further found part of their judgment was that the person with borderline personality disorder would be far more dangerous to the community, needed to be segregated a lot more from the community, and also was in need of coercive or restraining kinds of treatment compared to the person who had, the defendant who had the complex mental health problem. So these effects of the analysis of the jury were nothing to do with the charges or the court processes. It was purely based on the diagnostic label itself. So this is really a prima facie evidence that stigmatic patterns in the community boil over when it goes to the courtroom. So when it goes over to the courtroom, what happens is that the same community lack of awareness, or I would say dysfunctional awareness about personality disorder, blows over when jury judgments are made. And hence, further literature exploring the impact of the diagnosis of personality disorder on the behavior in the courtroom would be something which researchers would be quite keen to explore. Okay, something happened there. Okay, so let's move to something which is very topical here. And so it is almost, I think, 30 years since, in I think 1988, it was propounded that the terminology of borderline personality disorder itself, the wording itself, can have a bias or unintended bias. And therefore, ICD-11 came up with a new kind of diagnosis, severe or personality disorder with patterns, borderline pattern. But it seems to be from this jury findings that the new wordings don't seem to have made much of an impact to affect the bias on the hearings, bias on the judgments. And so people with a personality disorder seem to be looked as someone with a personality flaw rather than a personality disorder or a mental disorder, a medical disorder, or a psychiatric disorder. So the distinction between the person themselves or the intrinsic personhood and the diagnosis of personality disorder seems to be rather blurred. So I think all over the world, and we have some prominent researchers even in Victoria who are now on kind of a campaign to change the wording of personality disorder. And in fact, in the discussion section, we've got Satya here, so I think we may start talking about how some of these mental health researchers and psychiatrists are wanting that change away from the borderline personality disorder. So today's focus really, we are going to talk about civil law. So two kinds of civil law. One is that which is the workers' compensation law, and the second is what happens in the family court, so the family law. So the family law is mainly dictated by the Family Law Act of 1975 and the other subsequent act of 1995. But let's go first to work cover or compensation law. So the Victorian, we'll talk mainly about Victoria because all states do seem to have nuanced changes to how their laws operate. Sorry, this is pretty sensitive. So we'll talk about the Victorian laws. So they have several laws. So the Occupational Health Safety Acts of 2004 and 2017, along with the Rehab Act of 2013 and the Accident Compensation Acts. So it's governed by these 5 acts. Another influencing factor is the eggshell rule. I don't know how many of you are aware, but the eggshell rule really came into being when there was a person who had a congenital wafer-thin skull. And what happened was this worker was playing around with a pencil at lunch break in the office environment, and all the co-workers were playing around with a pencil. And they were throwing this pencil around, and then accidentally, of course, the pencil with the kind of pointy end downwards hit the skull of this particular person who had the wafer-thin skull, and that caused permanent brain damage. So this had a lot of toing and froing when it went to court because this person could never work again. And obviously the insurance company, the employer, and the barristers on that side, the defendant's side, they kept on barracking or saying that it's because this person had a wafer-thin skull, he should have known what to do or what not to do, and that the workplace was quite safe, and they were trying to deny liability. However, from the side of the plaintiff, so the injured workers, barristers kind of negated all the statements of the barristers on the defendant's side by saying that, look, even if there was a predisposition, and there was a major predisposition, whatever happened in the workplace, and the employer should have known what to do and should have provided a healthy workplace, because the medical records of the employer in the human relations wing did have information about the medical information. And so this case was won on the side of the plaintiff, the injured worker. So going by that eggshell rule, which is not really stated anywhere, but it comes out in judgments from judges from time to time. We'll look at one such judgment very quickly, very soon. But what it also means, if someone has got, let's say, a vision problem and then sustains a fall in a workplace which is reasonably lighted for average eyesight, and then they sustain a back injury, it will still be liable on the employer and the insurance company to pay the damages, because even if there was a predisposition, they are still liable because they failed to provide a safe workplace. But for all of us dealing in psychiatry and mental health, what is important is that there's a take-home message, because even when there is a major predisposition to a psychiatric illness, or whether even if there is a pre-existing condition, a worker is suffering from, which is in relative remission or close to remission or is stable. And then due to a stressor at work, if that condition flares up or there is an exacerbation, the employer will be quite liable, even if the employer were to attest that this particular stressor was not enough to cause an illness in several other employees who were subjected to the same stressor. Okay, let's talk about a real case. So this is a case about a female in her 20s, and she had lodged a work cover claim because of bullying in the workplace by her manager. So this case, when it was lodged, initially it was rejected. It was rejected based on the premise that the employer and the HR department of the employer made that this person already had an extensive psychiatric history and that there was no bullying in the workplace and the workers was treated fairly and in a reasonable manner in the workplace. So after the initial rejection, the worker lodged a mediation and the worker was sent to me for an IME assessment. So following the mediation and the IME assessment, it was found that the worker was suffering from an adjustment disorder related to bullying, but something else also came out. There was a secondary stressor which came out in the interview that the HR department had breached medical information about the worker to other co-workers, which had resulted in discrimination against the worker in the workplace. So finally, after the IME assessment and after mediation, the claim was accepted, and it was fairly accepted, I would think. So what it really shows us is that even in this case, although the person was under active treatment and had a diagnosis of complex trauma and personality disorder, it was accepted because under those acts which I was telling you about, those 5 acts, they say that employment needs to be only one of the contributing factors. It does not have to be the only factor or does not have to be the only significant contributing factor. So this is the real case, just to highlight what I was saying earlier. This was a case in '98 in the Supreme Court of Queensland where the judge enunciated. This was a female worker who was a sales manager in a newspaper, and she was bullied by the manager at regular meetings where he would use foul language, would be aggressive, would be demanding, would be condescending. However, this kind of tirade of the boss or the manager was against not only this worker, but against several other workers. However, she went on to develop a personality disorder, and the judge in his final verdict said that it was the employment which was the major cause of the personality disorder, despite the fact that this person had a traumatic childhood and had a traumatic young adulthood as well. So it just goes to show that work has to be only a contributing factor. But in this case, of course, the judge went even ahead, that the employer had breached its duty of care towards the employee and failed to provide a safe work environment. So bullying is really wrong. It's fundamentally wrong because it is taking advantage of someone who's weaker or in a more junior hierarchical position in the organization. That's when bullying generally happens. In fact, in the late 1990s and in the early 2000s, the main work cover cases used to be from RSI. I don't know how many people remember that. And back injuries, of course, which has still stayed. So RSI was repeated strain injury caused by keyboard work, but that has been replaced now in the last 7 to 8 years with bullying and harassment in the workplace. That seems to be the #1 reason why work cover claims are lodged, at least in the psychiatry or the mental health section. So WorkSafe Victoria takes a very serious kind of note of bullying in the workplace, and they define bullying as, I'll just read this out because this is the WorkSafe Victoria definition. So workplace bullying is repeated unreasonable behavior directed at an employee or group of employees that creates a risk to health and safety. So it is, of course, fundamentally wrong for anyone to engage in bullying. And although I said earlier it's generally hierarchical, but we are coming across cases where bullying can be at the same level. So co-workers bullying another co-worker. So provision of a safe workplace, and the workplace is, of course, at all levels, is required, not only by the employer and the HR department, but by the employees themselves towards each other. And of course, in the work-cover kind of area, it requires attention to safety from the insurance companies, from legal professionals, the pre-legal or paralegal professionals, because every insurance company has got a legal department. Major employers also have a legal department. And then, of course, the solicitors, especially the plaintiff solicitors, and also the first port of call, which seem to be general practitioners, and of course, the injured worker themselves. So WorkSafe Victoria takes this even further and looks at, they have in their manuals enunciated what a safe working or safe workplace needs to look at. So a safe work environment is not only good for the employer, but it's also good for the employer themselves and for business. So this is the OHS Act of 2004, and then it had a revision in 2017. So it said that employers have to provide a safe work environment, not only at the initial stage, but consistently and in collaboration with all employees, including the OHS reps. And employers, of course, have a duty of care to cooperate with this definition of provision of a safe workplace, but also the employees have to comply with all the regulations to see that the whole workplace is safe. So this is an initiative, the Employee Assistance Program. This is a free initiative available to all employees, and it is available through all major government organizations, but also through most of the private organizations. This is a free service available to all employees, and this is not only available to all employees, but this is also available to the next of kin of all employees, because their mental health can also affect the employees. So this is a service which is really to enhance the emotional, psychological well-being of the employee. And this is totally confidential, and an employee or an injured worker or even a worker before they get an injury can access this program. It's completely confidential. It is at arm's length from the employer. And it is a good resource for us when we are treating people with personality disorder to be very aware of it, because this is another kind of layer of assistance which can be accessed by them, and there is absolutely no fee, and it's confidential from the managers and the employer. So let's talk about a family law case. So this was a single mother in her 30s with 2 children with her background history of borderline personality disorder. It went to the initial pre-hearing at the family law court. And at the initial hearing, of course, the father and the barrister, the testimony was that the mother was not a good enough mother, predominantly based on the previous years' history of impulsive behavior, self-harm, frequent hospitalizations. And so the court mandated 2-3 things. One of the things was that the mother was given only 3 hours supervised access with her own mother in attendance when the 2 children had contact with the mother on the weekends. But also the court mandated treatment for 18 months, after which the court would review it. So this person was in treatment with me and also with a psychologist. And at the end of 18 months, she had been in remission for at least 12 months. And so there was a second court hearing, and it was quite an extensive court hearing of about 5 days. And after the end of that court hearing, the good news was that because she had proven to be maintaining not only stable mental state, but also had a job, a full-time job, and had undertaken all the mandated court treatments. She was given 5 days a week unsupervised contact with 2 days with the father. And of course, there was further mandates from the court that she needed to continue with the mandated treatment as dictated by the court, and once a month with the psychiatrist, once in 2 weeks with the psychologist, and also 3 monthly reports from the psychiatrist. So if she were to fulfill all those, then the contact would stay. So this is further exemplified by a federal circuit court judge, Judge Smith in Sydney, where there was a case of a 3-year-old, and the father was given initial sole parental custody with no custody at all to the mother. But the judge then mandated that if the mother were to undergo court-mandated psychiatric treatment, it would drastically improve her chances for reapplying to the court for increasing that contact to a far more positive contact. So for a person to be, when they are involved in the family law court and they are under treatment with you, and when you are interfacing with the legal system or doing any kind of advocacy on behalf of patients, we as providers, it's good to remember that having a mental illness does not automatically disqualify someone from being a parent and having fairly substantial or significant custody or parental responsibility. As you all know, custody is now becoming an outdated term, and parental responsibility is the new term, which encompasses all that is custody, but also includes all decisions by the parent on behalf of the child for all medical issues, schooling, education, getting a passport or not, all legal decisions. So, and also good to remember that a parent may not, who's one of our patients, get full custody, but they will eventually get custody if they subscribe to court-mandated treatment. I'm going to now go in a rush because I've been warned that I've got only a couple of minutes left. So just very quickly, objection hearsay. You may have heard that in Perry Mason or in some of the courtroom legal dramas. What does it really mean? So what hearsay really means is that it's really colloquial, he said, she said. It's secondhand information. It's inadmissible in court, unless, of course, there are very special circumstances, which we'll get into if someone asks a question about that. So what are the do's and don'ts which we have to remind ourselves so that we can remind our legal professionals when we are dealing with them on behalf of a patient? So one of the don'ts is really not to try and give someone with BPD insight into themselves and their behavior. Leave that to the therapists or the professionals. Secondly is not focus too much on the past, focus on the present and the future. This will only not be very useful because this will just increase defensiveness and the person will just get entrenched into a stalemate. Don't ever emotionally confront them with your own anger and frustration because legal professionals can get irritated and annoyed. So they shouldn't do that because that can only create problems for the patient. Don't ever tell them they have a borderline personality disorder or any other disorder for that matter, because that's for the treating doctor or the therapist. You are the law professional. I tell them, you just stick to what you have to do and what you're good at. Of course, give them your full attention, sympathy, empathy, and respect in a consistent holding way, and don't steer away from it at any time. And focus more on choices and thinking rather than emotions. So be collaborative in getting their inputs in what choices they have to make. And also do gather information from them and make them feel as much comfortable as you can in terms of reassuring them that whatever they tell you won't be at the risk of you abandoning them, because the legal professionals should not get ambushed in court with new information that may come out. So we have talked about this, that the judge is really concerned about the children's welfare, and therefore court-ordered treatment can be very effective. And if there is termination of relationship, it's best to take a step-by-step approach. So these are the conclusions. Because I've been told I'm rushing, I'm not going to read them out. I'll just leave them on the screen for a minute. So stigmatization in the legal system, and especially for all mental illnesses, but more so for complex trauma and personality disorders. So why are we talking about all this? Because this can lead to less than optimal decisions, both in the civil law, in the work cover area, as well as in family law. So in family law, if the judgments are biased, they can go against our patients or persons suffering from a personality disorder in terms of custody, in terms of how much parental responsibility they get. And in terms of work cover law, it can go against our client because their claim may be not accepted. This can lead to financial problems, and then that can be added stress or causing exacerbation of their condition. So where to from here? So what do we talk about? Or what are our aims to improve? How can we improve the legal outcomes from the way it is right now? So there are three-pronged strategies which I would propose. One is education at several levels, and education taking into account key stakeholders. Key stakeholders are not just the providers of treatment, which is, of course, the therapists, doctors, psychologists, social workers, all allied health, or whoever is delivering the therapy, the lived experience people themselves, their carers, the legal professionals, the employers, the insurance companies, WorkSafe Victoria, the family law court. So having all these key stakeholders and then formulating different platforms. The platforms could be educational, formal educational sessions. The platforms could be media, platforms could be social media, platforms could be podcasts. So these are the various platforms which can come into play to deliver to raise the awareness about the diagnosis and about personality disorders. The second is, of course, provision of access to medical legal experts. I think Spectrum has already started that. I know that Satya has already started this process with provision of very specialized medical legal expertise to people suffering from personality disorder. And third is advocacy at all levels. So these are some of the sources and references and resources for people not only suffering from personality disorders and who are in the throes of a legal process. I don't have time to talk about it, and these are some education resources for all of us as providers, which we can access to help make the workplace a better workplace, especially for people with personality disorders, to make it safe and to make it safe, especially when they are faced with any stressors. Thank you all. Thank you, Satya and Spectrum, for inviting me here today. And thank you all the organizers, Demi and Jacqueline. And special thanks to the people here who may be there with lived experience of mental illness and psychological distress, and of course their carers as well. And thank you, Lucas. Thank you all.
Okay, can everybody hear me okay? So I've neglected to introduce Andy Bauman, who's a Spectrum clinician, and he's been moderating the chat online. Andy's going to read us the first question for you, Nitin.
Sure. Thanks, that was a great presentation. We've just had a question come through the chat, which was querying in relation to the case that you referred to earlier, where the court ruled in favour of the plaintiff that the workplace bullying had contributed to a person's personality disorder. How might those kind of judgments ruling in favour of the plaintiff potentially increase discrimination against workers who have mental health disorders or vulnerabilities, and how might we monitor and address that risk?
Sorry, can you repeat the last bit? I didn't really get it.
Well, I think the worry is that if we start thinking about there being liability for people that have mental health considerations of varying kinds in the workplace, that there's a potential for maybe employers to not employ them in the first place because of a perceived risk or some other concern about people who have established mental health problems, and how we can control for that and to make sure that people have a level playing field?
I think that's an excellent question. I don't know if you all understood it. I'll just paraphrase that. So the question really, as I understand it, is because there is liability for people who have a personality disorder and who may then get an exacerbation in the workplace due to your workplace stressor, would employers or HR departments then have a bias in the initial recruitment when they become aware that someone has a history of a personality disorder? And if so, if there is a bias, what can we do to prevent that from happening, to make it more fairer? I think the answer to that is really multi-layered and nuanced, and there's no real direct black and white answer. I think WorkSafe Victoria is doing quite a lot in this area, and so much so that I'm seeing a lot of injured workers. Not only me, but I'm part of 4 peer review groups. So all my fellow forensic psychiatrists are seeing a lot of these cases which are being accepted. So at least we have got over the first hurdle, which is seeing to it that liability is owned up by the employer and the insurance company for anything that happens in the workplace, which then precipitates or exacerbates a pre-existing condition. But the second part of the question is more difficult to answer, that what can we do to see to it that HR and employers don't have a bias towards recruiting people who have already outlaid at the outset, at the recruitment process, that they have a personality disorder. And therein lies the last slide which I was talking about. I think it's a 3-pronged attack. It's not someone like me saying, do it and don't do it, or I'm part of the medical legal group of Victoria telling the courts what to do or the employers what to do. I think it stems from several things. So like I said, it stems from education at various levels, including all the key stakeholders. So if we have the key stakeholders as the employer and HR themselves and the legal department of the employers and WorkSafe, then that can help us to kind of help to negotiate that bias or that perceived bias or possible bias. The second thing is, of course, providing not only formal but informal medical legal advice promptly to the injured worker. And finally, and most importantly, is, of course, advocacy through various ways and at several layers.
Great, thank you very much. I think there's certainly more questions. I definitely have a question, but I think we're probably going to be out of time at the moment. So I'd like to thank you again for a really excellent presentation. If everybody could join me. Nitin, Nitin, don't go quite yet. That's for you.
Oh, thank you.
Okay. So I'm going to move on and introduce our next speaker, who is going to be online. Do we have her all set to go? So this is Associate Professor Loyola McLean, who's going to be presenting her topic entitled Working It Out Together in Complex Trauma and Personality Changes. We meet and then we move. Loyola is a consultant liaison psychiatrist and psychotherapist in public, private, and academic practice with interests in the relational body-mind interface, stress system disorders, attachment, trauma, psychotherapy, and integrated trauma-informed care. Her adult attachment interview coder and trainer experience influences her work, as does her family's stolen story and her lived experience as a carer and a child of parents with mental illness. So she's part of the Westmead Psychotherapy program, designing and delivering the new online Masters of Trauma-Informed Psychotherapy, and part of the Masters of Medicine Psychiatry FEC team at the Brain and Mind Center at the University of Sydney, which is my alma mater, and speaking to us from New South Wales. So welcome, Professor.
Thank you. It's such an honour to be here. I would like, if it's okay, just to take a moment to acknowledge the country from which I am Zooming today, which is the Gadigal country. So long under the custodianship of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. And I would like to acknowledge elders past, present and emerging, especially because I think in a way we are trying to join today in a kind of a conversation that really First Nations people around the world do so beautifully, to share knowledge and to foster culture in a relational and connected kind of way. So my talk is really coming around this notion. I'm just going to leave the front slide up for a moment, because to me, this beautiful image of the Milky Way is actually also like a kulamon, the beautiful bark tool that people can hold food in, or a child. And some of that notion of a holding frame in our relationships is, to me, very important. I really think that we have to meet before we can move together. And in the Wurundjeri that I'm trying to learn, having had a connection to country and kin interrupted by a stolen experience, the phrase in Wurundjeri is Nanu Wanarayimana Nuragi. And it means we are walking home together. And I think that notion of being companions on this journey of recovery is hugely important. We've been already hearing this morning in such a profound way that complexity is challenging, but I'm trying to sort of suggest to you that a very integrated approach is satisfying as well as helpful for all of us that are involved in this, carers, clinicians, the patients, consumers. And that the richer our model of intervention can be, I think our experience is becoming the better. And it's so exciting to hear the legal aspects that were raised in the talk that's just gone before. With all this kind of capacity that we're trying to mobilize for nurturing and repair and recovery, relationships are central, because this is where we develop. This kind of gorgeous connection and the beautiful joy that it brings to each other is extraordinary. And we're in a world now where we're having to acknowledge that that interpersonal co-regulation that begins with the beautiful proto-conversation we just had an image of is important to growing our capacities to regulate. What we're growing are those capacities to manage stress, strain, conflict, and that was spoken about so beautifully in the opening keynote. We also need, however, to generate that joy and vitality so that life is just not kind of mundane and miserable in its simplest way, although I'm a big believer in the mundane, as you'll hear. But we need those relationships to be positively, contingently connected conversations. And I like to think of this as being in an ecological matrix, growing this body-mind. The past beats inside us, it often repeats, and it often feels as though the way it was will be the way it always will be. But, you know, we can work it out together. And that's the message that comes when a secure attachment template is laid down early. There's this lived experience that together we can work. So, unfortunately, what happens in early complex trauma, and even ICD-11 doesn't really deal with some of the nuances around relatedness that can lead to clinically what we think of as complex trauma. It still has a bar that's fairly high. But in terms of human relatedness, something can get in the way. And of course, in a disorganized attachment, that's that real fear of the other, so that I'm in such a conflict. I want to go in for help, which is so human, so natural, but fear of you has got me in some kind of a spin or backing away or acting in a way that loses our chance to connect, to improve things or work things out. Therapeutic relationships are themselves this incredible chance to learn how to rework this template. So here you can see this excited baby, this pretty delighted mum, and the baby likes this interaction. Mum likes it, and they're free to move across these domains. There's connections across gaze, probably voice, their position, their arousal, and in an activity, and the activity they're sharing here is the proto-conversation, and authors like Pat Crittenden have operationalized some of these modes of connecting from parent infant in a lovely way. If this were modulated in the next moment, if it were a video, we could really track how well regulated and co-regulated this dyad are. And so that's what we do in therapy and treatment together. We track this flow, this connection in context. The conversational model, the cue is we asking ourselves, what happens next? Underpinning all this is the very powerful attachment system. It's a biopsychosocial organizing system that, over many repeated interactions, is organizing that which is not yet laid down in software or networks at birth, which is the incredible interactions with different parts of a small human being, getting those parts of mind and body, autonomic nervous system, immune system, all working in a coherent way together that's adapted to the environment. It's a very important interplay of a genetic and an epigenetic environment. So this stuff is simple. It's not simple, although nature has made it unfold in a simple way. It's complex in all the stuff that feeds into it. As we grow older, we do develop other capacities, and that can mean we've got capacities to connect with others in a different way. So sexuality is another one of those powerful parts of our life as it enters in adolescence. Then we can become partners, we can parent, we can have a role in the community as a mentor, maybe as a grandparent. All these options are super important. And that attachment is a powerful predictor of our health and our health resilience. And there's a lot of research out there, and we know it's central to homeostasis. So at the heart of development, Bowlby said, is this incredible phylogenetically preserved system that fosters that bond of care between a carer and then the infant. This organizing role that we now can see in neurological, psychological, social development. And we can see the behaviors around it in our assessments and in our clinic rooms and in the kind of interactions on our wards or our units. We can feel the emotion around it. And we can certainly listen to the stories of what's gone on in people's lives and our patients' reflections on it. And we ourselves move in dyadic patterns that are co-constructed by this system. When things go well, we tend to have a more secure template, and then we're free to ask for help, and we have this sense of ourselves as being lovable. When things are less than optimal in that sort of early child rearing period, we either have to cool down our negative emotion and manage so much more ourselves at a cost. The preoccupied state of mind, what we think of as resistant or anxious ambivalent in children, has this quality where I don't feel so confident. I'm anxiously trying to draw you in, and that's done with actual anxiety expressed or with a kind of an anger. Come on, help me. I really need your help. It's a protest. Trying to pull somebody in. But the cost for that particular state of mind is, of course, I'm less competent at calming myself down, soothing myself, and regulating myself. And then for our patients who experience disorganization, and in fact, any of us at points of loss, trauma, cumulative stress that overwhelms our homeostasis, we will experience this sense of personal disorganization. And for a child, and if our stress goes on long enough, the kicker develops that we starts to break down our trust in the relationship and our trust in others, so that we become afraid that the other, instead of helping, will do some kind of harm. So I want to tell you about Martha, who I've got permission to tell her de-identified story. Her mum had DID, and my patient, the daughter, acted and reacted as though she had been sexually abused, despite no actual history that we could discover. She likely had a transgenerational transmission of trauma via an unresolved and dissociative state of mind in her mum. Because when the mum is afraid and disorganized, that has a disorganizing effect on the offspring. Mum was frightening at times and frightened, and she was managing horrendous familial incestuous abuse. How that came out is that many of the conversations with my patient as a child and a young adult was suffused with an inappropriate sexual intensity and meaning. For example, when she had an otitis media, so an inflammation of the inner ear, that pressure in the eardrum was described by mum with a sort of a sexual sense about the pressure of it. And so my patient experienced so many different kinds of intrusions in her life as kind of associated with this area of invasion, of being trapped, of hosting the other, of being occupied. And she felt, as you can imagine, quite alienated from others. There was a real challenge for her to feel alone and together in relationships, which is the phrase we use around this in the conversational model, that lovely way of being oneself, but being connected with another. So this notion is that with this kind of terrible disorganization, we're out of sync. The basic rhythms and positive flow of life are not learned. There's no adequate matrix that's helped that form. And then how to breathe, how to sleep, how to eat, how to move safely all need attention. And you kind of think you can see that from your own work or your lived experience, or maybe from the first talk today and the incredible kind of co-occurring mental illness and the interacting that happens around mental illness. There's this difficulty to feel safely connected to self and to others, and a sense of little joy. So to me, this is a beautiful picture of a relatedness between an adult, maybe a parent, and a child. And that's how a lot of my patients have read it. But the patient I just spoke about said to me when she saw it for the first time, she was shocked. And she said, "Why is that mother shitting over that baby?" So in other words, for her, what was coming was anticipated as being negative, awful, and not positive. And this incredible emotional experience of being harmed by the other is one of the things that needs to heal when people come into treatment. So because, it's important to have summaries because we forget all this stuff that comes up in talks. The idea is that the story begins when ourselves are growing in relationships. They need to be best connected, responsive relationships. The first are our attachment relationships. They shape our body mind. They start us on the way. But as clinicians and as those who have got some block to their flourishing, we get aware of something getting in the way and then what might be needed to have to change it. My suggestion to you, and I think there's a lot of work around this that's emerging, is that when stresses or coping are overwhelmed, our current homeostasis breaks down and symptoms emerge. So even with people with personality disorder are not always needing an upswing in treatment or even presenting for treatment. So what's gone on that somebody's now presenting? As clinicians, we track what's going on for people. We track what's going on in our teams and services, how they've coped and why they aren't now. And we notice that distress, disturbance, distance, disorganization, dissociation, I call them all the D words, right? And we notice the repeating patterns. And we consider what is the cumulative stress, the trauma, the loss that might be currently disorganizing the system. And then we work to collaboratively understand, and of course we call that a formulation, to understand the presentation, to understand diagnosis, and of course maybe diagnoses, and then a rich integrated multimodal management plan. And this is about associating, connecting where we can to counter dissociation or disconnection, thinking richly and thinking in a trauma-informed way. But of course, given this propensity for relational life to be difficult and for the treatment of those who are suffering to be itself a stress or a trauma, we need to remember that sometimes we're part of the solution, but us, our teams, our services are sometimes part of the problem. So to self, and the little group I work in like to make it a verb because it does involve a lot of activity, right? We've got to try and manage reality with its stresses and strains, and we learn best in relationship how to rest, play, love, and work. And we heard a lot about that work in just the last session. To survive and self-protect and also live creatively, we just need that sense of vitality, right? We need to be able to story, to dream, not just comply or disengage. And our goal is really kind of to live long enough to love and nurture ourselves and others, and to be loved and nurtured. And one might pivot those two around actually and put them in a different order. The good news is that psychotherapeutic relationships foster change. And it does this in a number of ways, from that incredible meeting in the moment, that moment-to-moment connectivity in a session that requires a mutual responsiveness in the dyad, and then the larger patterning brought about both by new patterns of repeated interaction, and that means the procedural way of being together is changing. And then over time, if that happens long enough, we are designed that will shift our attachment template, our stress regulation, and its organizational system, which is wonderful, because that then starts to repair the earlier deficits to the attachment templates and states of mind. As this morning, the keynote was really pointing out so beautifully, Lois was telling us that you foster the development of self, and actually you can also foster repair from PTSD. So as we support somebody's self to grow, we are giving them the kind of capacities to begin to integrate their trauma in a stronger way. And in fact, some of that will happen just offline without being directly addressed, because they will be doing reflecting and thinking and remembering in different ways. But our holding in mind is very important as we shift both conscious and unconscious regulation and dysregulation. And part of that is that in a relationship, we're connecting up the facts and the feelings of what is between us and what is happening outside our clinical consultation or therapy, and also what's happened in the past. We connect it in flow and in a conversation where we kind of notice when then the something gets disrupted. I love this picture, so full of life and colour. And it reminds me of William James telling us that thoughts, as we feel them to be connected, are what we mean by personal selves. So James very nicely, as we're entering the 20th century, really said, hey, it's all connected, and kind of was a wake-up call for people working in psychology. More recently, Maunder and Hunter, CL psychiatrists who are interested in psychotherapy, have brought out on the front foot of their work around attachment and its importance for healing and health, a book. Yes, I do have reservations about the title. I think putting damaged right up front may be honouring that experience for people, but I just wonder if it also is a bit shocking and then we forget that there is a way to repair. But anyway, it's their book, they get to call it what they like. And inside, it's very important work that emphasises the early origins of much later or lifelong illness and the need for a positive therapeutic relationship. Because with trauma and loss, we loop. We can get caught up in reenactments, we get caught in the web of life or the web of a relationship. We get sucked into this kind of black hole of our dissociative experience. We fragment, we feel lost. We get into battles sometimes. We can often feel incredibly confused and trapped, as I think I told you about Martha. We can feel quite frozen, unable to make a gesture or a movement, and so awful when there is this not just emptiness, but a real deadness or loss of vitality. And some of our patients are working very hard to organise, but they're flipping between ways of being organised, sort of dismissing and trying to cope on their own 1 minute, trying to pull us in an anxious or an angry way in the next. Very uncomfortable. So what I'm suggesting to you is that we're going to be noticing, excuse me, the chaos, the rigidity, the compartments, the gaps, the knots, the dysregulation. So one of my suggestions is a bit like a symptom review we used to learn about in medicine. We really think about scanning for those effects of trauma and loss and overwhelming stress at every level of function. I could have put neurotransmitters in, I could have put receptors, but let's just call it cellular. Sensory, somatic, emotional, cognitive, behavioral, perceptual, right as we then begin to connect to the spiritual. In a way, I could invert the whole thing, couldn't we? And really go from a bottom-up perspective as the person connects to the world and to the universe outside. But any of these areas can show the signs of trauma and loss, but any of them can be strengths, levels in the system that are working quite well. And then we've got something positive to engage on, as well as ways to connect when there needs to be something addressed. So I'm suggesting to you that we need to take a systemic and an ecological approach, intervening at any level of the system to nourish it. So nourishing the self, attending to it, both that positive pole of development as well as that other pole of trauma. And that, yeah, just even doing that will perturb the system. When we've really got our heads together, we can shake it up a little bit more actively, but that needs wisdom and gentleness and feedback about that this is okay. It's a time when we can be a bit more active or a bit more challenging. And most importantly, we have to really be with the person, really deeply listen. And I think we're so grateful to the Indigenous custodians of this term, like Rose Ongemerbauer, who's just really been such a light in sharing her custodianship of this concept of really deeply listening to the other and to the country. I think the hierarchy of engagement, which is such a useful paper written as a chapter years ago by Philip Graham and Leo Van Been, is also really important because it emphasizes that phase-based approach of getting safety and stabilization and then beginning to work with the personal in all sorts of minute, simple ways, and then working on coping mechanisms, dissolving, traumatic configurations. And then if we get there, these lovely moments where we're really meeting person to person in a really collaborative, flowing way. So when it works, it looks like this gorgeous tree digging down into the soil of the past and opportunity and then kind of rising up. So to me, it is a very poetic process, this meeting and moving. We have to remember that meeting means we need to work sometimes, and it might be hard and it might be fragile and it might break up in the next little bit, but we attend again so that then we can go on another journey together. And for some of us, it's one tiny step at a time and backwards. And for others, once we kind of connect, something starts to flow quite quickly, which is very exciting for all concerned. If we're working psychodynamically, or if we're attuned to the way the unconscious is impacting on our clinical encounters and our treatments, we are probably going to feel that impact of the past, that feel that something is getting in the way right here, right now. Bob Hobson has called it the problem being alive in the room, and it's that co-experiencing of the trauma system. In order to manage it, we really need to connect in the moment. So that's bottom down. But then other strategies that are top down and that are across systems are at times in our therapies going to be very important. So I want to just spend the next few minutes talking to you about the mundane, the human, because the conversational model, which I'm pretty much at home in, is a common factors model. We work the bond. We have a conversation to understand the problem together. And it's a particular kind of conversation. We're paying close attention to the feeling and sort of what's going on, the flow between us right now. And sometimes that attention helps us manage the difficult feelings right now because we wriggle and jiggle and, as a clinician, I'm trying to find you. And when things are going really well, it links up the past and the present more overtly, understands it, as Lois was saying, helps us have some control over the way the memories are coming into the moment. And then we lay the beautiful groundwork for choices around where to go from there. And of course, we can work in such different time frames. Acute work, where really meeting somebody in a crisis is such a privilege. Sometimes we can then contract that short work, maybe that medium work. And I have to say, I think a lot of our psychiatry trainees have a training in a medium-term therapy when they're doing a 40-session psychodynamic psychotherapy. And then, of course, we've got the beautiful international literature that talks about the success of our longer-term engagements. The connection is the key. We meet empathically and then we slightly shift and we repeat this step again and again and again. We reconnect and then we shift. And Dan Hughes has been so helpful in his work in the foster care world by talking about connection before correction. So safety, stabilization, manifested through a safe connection, and then can be our resourcing and our reintegration. Things repeat. There are these profound loops, and so we do need to be aware of them. What we do as clinicians is turn up, and in that first conversation or that first few moments of our repeated meetings, we deeply listen, we connect, we pay attention to the cues, non-verbal and verbal, and we give value to what we notice. And in the conversational model, that's called paying attention to the minute particulars. We're going to get great information if we do that. And the process will be human, meaningful, and satisfying. And then, maybe we're going to get to have another conversation, a longer therapy of some sort. But even if we don't, we will have achieved a one-session intervention. And this is what our consumers tell us. If they go to A&E, if they have a home visit, if they have a phone call and people really listen and connect, then that opportunity is so helpful. One of the ways that this is done in the conversational model is through the framework of psychodynamic interpersonal therapy. It's got great RCT evidence for a shorter number of sessions. The full model's been evaluated in several randomized controlled trials, and it's got comparative efficacy with CBT. And Els Guthrie's been very helpful in helping us start to roll out teaching of this. And they're very cheeky. They've kind of got a PDF that they share with us and allow us to share that's called Pit Light, which is a way of skilling up your, your clinicians. Anyone who's got empathy and a pulse can learn how to do this in a nice way and prioritizing the early skills in that process. And some of those early skills are what we're teaching our clinicians in the health service and the LHD I work in. We've also done work around actually working with the teams more actively, trying to help them sort out and process the trauma, maintain their empathy in the face of a lot of stress, work in a trauma-informed way. And then what we see are staff and caregivers as biopsychosocial regulators. So that Feeling Safer project allowed me to engage with the team and with change champions to really wrap around the team. There's a paper that you can access by Maloney, beautiful CNC that was involved in our project. And he writes as the lead author in such a beautiful way of the way he realized in a particular case, the way that deep listening helped. So how do you do it? Use statements rather than questions. You pick up cues, use your negotiating style and language, use understanding hypotheses, and you stay with feelings. I won't have time to go through this, but I think what I've done is try and map out and used a beautiful example of this from the PIT manual when that focus of feelings are there and when that understanding hypothesis is there. So you've got to have access to the slides. Please read it, please use it. Maybe think about going and having a look at the manual of Barker et al. So we can really do this stuff, this listening, this meeting, this moving, and it really helps our understanding of the physical embodiment of our patients as well. The take-homes or takeaways are that this collaborative safety is necessary to then helping us work it out together. We're learning to spot stress and loss and trauma, and we're understanding that we need to meet before we can move. We connect to foster something around disconnection, healing, association for dissociation, and collaboration instead of bossing about and control and unresponsiveness. Now, it's an unconventional way to maybe end something, but I want to play you a song. I'm hoping you'll just take a moment, maybe close your eyes or just listen. But it's written from that understanding that we really do need to heal not only ourselves and our relationships with the others as individuals, but with our Indigenous and First Nations people and with this country and our society. So in the interests of time, I'm going to end it there. It is the gorgeous Dig takeout of Janawiri Parka, but maybe another time. Thank you. That's me.
Can you hear me okay, Professor?
I can, thank you.
Thank you so much for that talk. It was really quite beautiful. There's a number of questions that are in the chat that are asking specifically about psychodynamic interpersonal therapy and maybe some ideas about resources that people might be able to access.
Absolutely. Now, look, if you get access to the slides, what I have done is highlight what are kind of like the go for gold, but then there's masses of others. Probably we are just to mention, we are really lucky now to have manuals for psychodynamic interpersonal therapy. So Barkham et al. 2017 is that. It's a SAGE volume. You can get it, if you're Kindle or paperback. And the medium-term approach, that is much more like short-term psychodynamic therapies the world around, STIP, meaning that you kind of got to have a patient that's really good to go and ready to work. So it's a lovely part of a stepped care approach. That's Joan Halliburn's version of her manual. And then, of course, we've got the longer-term manual, which is Russell Mears and team in 2012, so the Clinician's Guide to Borderline Personality Disorder. It has a beautiful sister model if you're really trying to get your head around dissociation and its connection, which probably I didn't say enough about, is so important in what Lois was speaking about, the co-occurring illness, because we certainly see other personality disorders besides borderline, a lot of avoidant personality disorder. Makes perfect evolutionary sense that you pull away from potential situations of harm, but also somatoform disorders and propensities for difficult to treat anxiety or depressions. And so what's nice about the psychodynamic and a stepped care approach is, of course, you can come in with what the person is wanting and needing at this point in time. So yeah, it's been very helpful to have manuals. Who would have thought you could manualize it? And they are kind of poetic manuals rather than just kind of clunky manuals. But I think they're very, very, very helpful. If you get stuck around the PIT training and understanding, you need some advice about where to go, always give me an email.
Thanks for that. And I actually have a question for you, because I really liked when you were talking about meeting people where they're at. It's certainly something that comes up clinically all the time. And I had two questions sort of seated in each other for you. The first one is generally how people get referred to your programs, how they're identified. And then the second question I had for you is about how you handle situations where the person may not be ready to talk about trauma, or there may be other issues that they think that are a bigger part of what's going on. And if you have any general tips about how to approach that.
Oh, absolutely. And I think that's one of the key things. So what I'm going to do is deal with the first one first and come back to that one.
Yep.
The first, people come to us because they have had pretty much difficulties that haven't been addressed by normal kind of a hierarchy of interventions, medication, shorter-term counselling or therapies. But we also have now a better stepped care approach developing, where we have wonderful liaison with the Emotional Health and Regulation Clinic, and we meet regularly. And so once somebody might have done a body of work there, Gold Card Clinic, a slightly longer intervention with ECRU, then they can get referred to us. We are in a very sad situation in New South Wales where our tertiary level referral capacity has been taken away. We only see people in the LHD now, which is creating a huge challenge in other LHDs and networks, because they don't necessarily all have the treatments. We have the beautiful Hunter New England psychotherapy program, gave us the beautiful research by Carla Walton and everybody there on DBT versus CM. But as a whole, people are really struggling with not enough access to services. What we don't take are people who struggle around violence or aggression, will impede the relationship at that point, or people who we think are not quite ready to take on therapy. Now we've got the PIT, which we can offer. Now we've got short-term dynamic therapy. We've got a referral back to ECRU. So we've got a better system to manage people who might not be quite ready to embark on a psychodynamic therapy of longer term, which is conversational model. Which brings us to the second part. Core to that conversational model approach is you are starting to establish that safety and stabilization. So you don't talk about trauma in an overt way until people are ready. That's one of the key things that might differentiate where somebody could come in and do maybe a 6-month therapy in STIP, because you've really kind of got to have enough personal regulation and supports in your background, a safe enough home to be able to really get going with STIP. And so that's one of the things you discern together in the assessment is, where am I at? What are my supports? Where am I up to? What can I manage safely, and what would be my next choice? Does that kind of make sense?
It absolutely does. Yeah, thank you for that response. So I think that we're probably at time. So I want to say thanks again. I'm hoping everybody can join me in thanking you. But first, did you get the flowers in the mail?
I don't believe so.
Okay, all right. We'll have to double check about where they're
Although
at.
I've been glued to my screen, so maybe something's turned up at my front door.
Well, that would have been
We'll
something
check.
if we timed it that well, but we'll check and see if they've gotten there. But can we all please join me in thanking Professor?
Thank you.